Hey everyone, it's Swank Ivy, and today I have Letters to an Asexual number 39 for you. Unfortunately, the one I'm going to read for you today is actually a conversation that is ongoing, but considering the sort of circular nature that it gets into toward the end, I kind of feel like there's not really going to be anything more to say if the conversation does continue past here. It's just going to be more of the same. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. And this is going to be some back and forth that happened in the comments of my author website, actually. First thing that you should know is the person came in to reply to another commenter first. So they weren't actually commenting on the page about my book by itself first. They were just kind of replying to another person. And the tone of it was kind of like, oh yeah, I see your point. You're very discriminated against as an asexual person, but... And then starts offering what they refer to as the sexual person's perspective, because that just never gets considered, they said. So in the interest of letting you good folks finally get to hear the sexual partner's perspective on all of this, so I'm going to go ahead and read you the person's comment. Just so you know, they tend to use the word sexual person as their terminology for a non-asexual person, and I tend not to use that. You know, I've been told that a lot of people who are not asexual don't like being called sexual people, but that's the terminology that this person has chosen to use for themselves, and they call asexual people A and themselves S sometimes, so when they say AS relationships, you'll get the idea. So this is the relevant part of our conversation. It is occasionally excerpted for clarity purposes and relevance. So here we go with the first comment in part. Seldom, if ever, is the point of view of the sexual partner in an AS relationship seen through the same glasses. The ace partner doesn't really understand what it means to expect a comprehensive sex life, and to have 100th of that in quantitative terms, 1,000th of that in qualitative terms. A true, honest, and thorough discussion of the issue leads inevitably to A, one of the two living in misery, B, the couple splitting up after a while, or C, the trendy solution, an open marriage, where both members are allowed to see what the neighbor looks like, but in actual fact is only the S member who does that. Are there other solutions that may fully satisfy both partners? Expectation of a comprehensive sex life is surely something that, if it's important to you, should be discussed with your partner, not simply expected without talking about it. If being sexually compatible in that way is a deal breaker for you, that should be communicated long before a long-term relationship is established. I think people don't really understand that sex is not guaranteed in these relationships, and is not a piece of the relationship that is automatically granted just by virtue of being in a relationship. As a person who wouldn't want a relationship, or sex in a relationship if I had one, I of course am not qualified to speak on how important it can be. But I do recognize that it is for many to most people. However, I do know the status quo is frequently exploited to make the asexual person in a relationship feel like they are remiss in a duty they never agreed to, but will be shamed for not offering. That said, I think if something, including sex, is essential in your relationship, you should not have to be without it. You just can't create a situation where your partner must comply if they feel it's essential they do not have sex. If you desire this thing, it doesn't necessarily follow that the other person is obligated to provide. Yes, the honest and thorough discussion you've mentioned does usually lead to dissatisfaction, splitting up, or open marriage. But I don't think there's anything wrong with open marriage. I couldn't tell if you were implying there is. I can't guarantee that there are solutions that will fully satisfy all partners in a relationship, because some relationships might not be mutually satisfied with each other. But there are also options to discuss what sort of sensual, intimate, sexual, physical, or romantic acts each person needs, and which each would be willing to engage in. Sometimes compromises can be reached, where one person uses toys or has less traditional sex, participates by observing, or experiments with activities until they find one they both like. I did a talk on asexual relationships at the University of Virginia if you'd like to search for Asexual Relationships Talk at University of Virginia on YouTube for more info. And so they replied as such. I now come to realize the notion of by default has not been taken into consideration because 99% of the population is S. By default, any of those 99% believe the person they fall in love with is also S. If that person is A, transparency rules dictate that she or he states that in no uncertain terms. Only then is the field leveled off. And there are no surprises. Nothing can be taken for granted. When you say if something, including sex, is essential in your relationship, you're setting out, without actually saying so, that there's a 50-50 possibility that sex is essential in a relationship, whereas we know there is a 1 to 100th possibility that sex is not essential in a relationship. It is therefore not by default, and should therefore be explicitly mentioned. Unfortunately, this is only now beginning to happen. In previous generations, the S partner just walked into a trap he or she couldn't have imagined existed. And I replied with this. You're conflating the state of not being asexual with finding sex essential in a relationship here. It is absolutely not essential in every relationship with a person who is not asexual. While I believe people should be realistic about their partner's sexual needs if they know theirs are uncommon, I believe it's wrong for anyone to assume their partner's sexual needs are similar to their own without asking and without talking about it. And I believe it's wrong to put an asexual person in a position to believe their uncommonness dictates that they should accept that they are unacceptable as mates for 99% of people. Plenty of people do not consider sexual similarity or sexual preferences in the mandatory category of relationship compatibility. I've had dozens of conversations with non-asexual people who prioritized other things in their relationships with asexual spectrum partners, and while they would probably prefer more sex if they got to create their ideal partner from clay, they understand that they don't get to do that. You also need to remember that asexual people don't necessarily know they're asexual when they enter a relationship, or ever, and may not realize except through repeated exposures to sex that it isn't about just getting used to it or having a lower sex drive than their partners. Societal pressure, shame, heteronormativity, and many other factors make asexual people feel like they are expected to compromise in many situations, and that they should do all of the compromising on the sexual front. It's nice when it doesn't work out that way, but implying that the asexual person is trapping someone by not clearly stating how they feel when they may not even know does suggest intention to put responsibility for incompatibility on the asexual person. In short, yes, it's likely that your partner will not be asexual when looking at the numbers, and yes, it's likely most non-asexual people won't contend with this, but every relationship will have some differences of desire on sexual and other matters, and within each individual relationship, the responsibility to negotiate that into something all partners can live with should be equally allotted to each partner. And another response from the original commenter. There must be a reason why you don't address the issue of by default. So let's rephrase this. In a given society, there are things that correspond to unless specified otherwise. Example, both members of a couple will carry out a certain amount of work, either inside or outside the home, so that there's a balance. A sentence like, I'm not doing the household chores because we never agreed on that is not acceptable. Of course, if before sharing a flat or a house, they agree otherwise, then that is different. But if they don't, a sound and reasonable assumption is that they will share the burden. The same holds true for having children within a marriage, for listening to music below 40 decibels, for getting dressed before opening the door to the neighbor, and for having sex. And hundreds of other conventions, which, by the way, vary from one society to the next. Within our Western society, a sex life of 2 or 3 times a week, between 20 and 60 minutes each time, is a given. Again, unless specified otherwise. In our discussion here, we are assuming they did not specify otherwise. So if afterwards one of the members says, I'm A, therefore we will be talking about 2 or 3 times a year. If It is that member who is changing unilaterally the rules of the game. The game is that a pawn in chess cannot move sideways. You may agree otherwise, of course, but in the absence of such an agreement, the pawn does not move sideways. And what I read from many aces is that they pinpoint their preferences ex post facto. So if you fall in love with a person and he or she is S while you are A, and for religious or other reasons there is no sex before the wedding, assuming you did not agree otherwise before getting married, your A parameters are not on the same level as those of your partner. Because if they are, then you are accepting that your partner does not work either inside, out, or outside the house, does not get dressed before opening the door, does not use the toilet when nature calls, and so many other conventions that are just part of our daily lives. And my reply to that is, and yet dozens, possibly more than 100 of the non-asexual people I've talked to about this disagree with you about what is expected regarding sex life. I've had a ton of conversations with non-asexual people who think attitudes like yours about how much sex everyone knows you should expect are inaccurate and ultimately unhealthy for relationships where desire differs on any level. You think it's a given. Plenty of people don't. And that's what I've been saying all along. If you believe you don't even have to talk about something important to you because it's so obvious you have a right to expect it, and you're willing to claim publicly that this is a nearly universal standard accepted by people who are not asexual, you're using the status quo in a way it shouldn't be used. Communication in relationships is key. And maybe instead of suggesting a vital issue isn't even worth talking about because you had a right to expect it was given, you might consider examining why you felt entitled to live your life without questioning this assumption. Comparing how much sex your partner is obligated to expect or expected to give you in a relationship to various understood norms of society is misleading, and the way you phrase it above steers into gaslighting. Essentially, we all agree on this. You're the statistical outlier. It's an especially toxic framework when it's used to present one partner as if they're cheating the other of a deserved experience. Nobody should feel like they owe another person sex. And in this age of resources at your fingertips, you should be able to see the incredible diversity of the sexual spectrum and the fact that standards you've been presenting as givens of human life are anything but standard. And if all the jokes in stand-up comedy and sitcoms about frigid wives and marriage being the end of a sex life are any indication, I think it's clear that it's far more than just me who disagrees that there's an established amount of sex that everyone's having. Not to mention that even if you take surveys and determine averages, studies of sexual behavior are not supposed to be used prescriptively. That is to say, you get a study that says the average couple of X years old has X amount of sex. That does not mean you get to take that result and use it to change someone's behavior if it's against their inclinations. I feel I'm wasting my words, though, because you literally put having sex less than 2 or 3 times a week on the same level of widely understood inappropriateness as refusing to wear clothes or use the toilet. The sooner we stop viewing sex as something we're entitled to, the sooner we'll focus on matching with people who want what we want, instead of claiming virtually everyone wants the same thing at the same level, so we might as well assume it's true without any discussion. And by the way, when I talked about this elsewhere, I also mentioned that, in some groups of people, maybe clothes aren't automatically assumed, and it's not just an understood thing that everybody wears clothes, although, there are laws where I live about the clothes that you're supposed to wear, and then also, like, using the toilet being an understood and expected thing. There are some people who don't because of disabilities or other reasons, so, that kind of leaves them out, but, I got the person's point. It's just, I wanted to throw that in there. So, I'm going to read the next comment from this person. Dozens. More than 100. Tons. You start with numbers. Fine. On focusonthefamily.ca, you will read According to Understanding Human Sexuality by Janet Shibley Hyde and John D. Delamater, McGraw-Hill, 1997. The largest percentage of married couples reporting in a study said they had intercourse 3 times a week. I read on a forum organized by Avon that a man complained he and his wife hadn't had sex for over 6 years. What do we do with these numbers? Nothing. Each couple is a world in itself, and if the argument is, I feel like doing it once a year, fine with me. But then, intellectual honesty leads you to refraining from providing any number to your feeling, because as soon as you come up with numbers, you all of a sudden have to become objective. And objectivity calls for studies, institutions, Kinsey Institute. A Gaussian curve, also known as normal distribution, and not what dozens say. None of my friends, male and female, none would agree that a relationship with 1 or 2 episodes a year is healthy. They would, of course, fully respect the A member, because respect is of the essence, but they would all call for a divorce or a free marriage, and they definitely would all agree to say everything goes provided you state it beforehand. I have read about hundreds of cases on the Avon forum where one of them discovered the other was A after a while. A healthy relationship should never tolerate that the S member all of a sudden discovers he or she should know. With knowledge comes the power to decide. That's all I'm saying. That's not all they're saying. So I replied with this one. You are either missing the point or deliberately obscuring it, because how much sex is normal to have is irrelevant to my point. What is relevant to my point is that people don't get to use statistics to assert that they shouldn't even have to have the conversation. That it's so much a given that you can expect to receive the amount of sex you want as a matter of course. That communication somehow isn't necessary on this element of a relationship because you already took it for granted. I brought up the huge number of people I've talked with who disagreed with you, not to pretend I'm making objective claims about the reality of sex and relationships, but to make it clear that people don't have to be asexual to have a completely different perspective on sex than you apparently do. The bottom line is that you've expressed an expectation. And you've claimed this expectation is so nearly universal that you wouldn't even need to talk about it with the one you love because it's as much of a given as expecting them to use the toilet. Asexual people are not the only ones who find this claim baffling and inaccurate. A big part of my activism is to get people to stop taking sexual norms for granted. Assuming your desired level of sex is a common understood standard so prevalent that it didn't need a discussion is an act of potential abuse. And I say this because it is far more likely to be used against the 1%, whose members are predisposed to be shamed into thinking they must comply, than it is to be used against the 99%, who may also have pain over this, but are much more likely to use consensus to frame the narrative as if it is the less sexual partner who is remiss in a duty. Not to mention that just because someone's in the 99% does not mean they are known to have the same opinion as you about how much sex you should be having. It's not as if some people are asexual and everyone else in relationships is having sex as per the terms you laid out. You give lip service to the notion that each relationship is a world in itself, but you do seem to think what everyone else is doing is somehow relevant to what people's intimacy should look like, and you do seem to think the most common answers as per survey numbers back up what you're entitled to expect. It just plain isn't a given that people's sex drives and interest in sex match up to what you believe is normal. And it sure is upsetting to imagine there are people going around invoking invisible clauses in relationship contracts. And they came back with this one. Does your activism also involve going against statistics? When you speak about not taking sexual norms for granted, do you mean to say, listen, the statistics from the WHO, the Kinsey Institute, Masters and Johnston, and so many others all point at an average of 2 to 3 times a week, but they're all wrong. Those are surveys, Julie, and that's what people do. It is neither good nor bad, it's just a behavior. What I think your activism leads you to do, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is to say to A's, listen, that's what most people do, but you're not a monster if you want to do it once a year. You don't have to be pushed into any other behavior, and I agree. What I'm adding to it is this, any other behavior, but you must state it. So, in no uncertain terms to your partner, because if your partner is an S, and there are 99% chances that he or she is, your partner is fully entitled to believe you're an S too. That's all I'm saying. And again, I speak from many stories read on the Avon forums. The vast majority of A's fail to report it to their partner in advance. I'm not dwelling into reasons, behaviors, or anything else. What I'm saying is that the S partner just discovers it, and that's unfair. And you, as an activist, can make the difference by telling your audience that A's should never have to indulge, to accept, to suffer, but they should not have to inflict suffering onto the person they love by refraining from stating the truth, their truth, up front. Then the S partner is also given a chance to decide. And then the original person who made a comment on my nonfiction book page, who all of this is a response to, came back and said this: "Hi, I really wasn't expecting a big deal to be started from my first comment." Excerpting this, I don't agree that a partner is fully entitled to believe that their partner is sexual. One should never assume what a person's orientation is or decide to go with what is believed to be the default orientation. This is just one of many unhealthy attitudes that is just not just harmful to asexuals, but to other orientations as well. And the person I've been arguing with says, so it's an unhealthy attitude for the cab driver to expect that you'll pay when you get to your destination? Or for the waitress to expect you'll pay the bill when you're finished eating what you ordered? 99% of those having dinner at a restaurant pay their bills. 99% of passengers pay their bill upon arriving at their destination. 99% of people are sexual." And the commenter says, "Yes, it is." And that's a response to, yeah, that's an unhealthy attitude. Yes, it is. You are not entitled to sex if you are or are not in a relationship. Everyone has the right to say no to sex in a relationship. If one person ignores the other person's desire to not have sex in the relationship, it can become abusive or toxic. Your examples don't work because in them, the people in those situations are legally obligated to pay for or render the service requested. As I said above, people have a right to say no to sex and are not obligated to have sex if they don't want to. If you want to have sex with someone, hire a hooker. That is more in line with your examples because you're paying them for a service. People in relationships are not in them solely for the sex. It is a partnership between the people involved to do and work with, each to compromise to meet each other's needs without placing demands on them. So, and I came back into the conversation at this point and I said, it's kind of bizarre that you're continuing to claim that because 99% of people are sexual, they are therefore entitled to do what surveys report is common. Averages existing does not entitle you to simply expecting that your relationship will be average. Well, multiple reports designate this number to be typical, therefore I have every right to expect that my relationship will involve typical sex too. That is ultimately an abusive, entitled attitude toward sex that is right at the very root of what I want thrown out right out with the trash. And it's phenomenal that you would conflate your own sexual expectations with people doing their jobs. Having sex in a relationship is not at all like having a job you agree to perform for money. And not having sex in a relationship is not at all like cheating someone out of something they were promised. Individuals in relationships do not automatically promise sex by virtue of being in a relationship with you, and it is your responsibility to talk about how you and your partners will express your intimacy. It is not as if everyone with a sex life that approaches typical simply mutually expected that it would be. Long story short, you are presenting something as a given that is not a given, and you are trying to use statistics to back up your assumption that they're a given. They do not support your belief that a certain frequency of sex is a given. There will always be an average. The average is not the same as should be and therefore is expected. Averages exist because people are all over the map. You have no more right to expect the average than you do a right to be taller than you are if you're shorter than the national average. And this person came back one more time for this conversation and said, "For once we seem to be talking about the same. I read, everyone has the right to say no to sex in a relationship." Yes, but before you enter that relationship. Then the partner knows. If you are an S, you will not all of a sudden dislike sex. But if you are an A, your partner an S, and you withhold that tiny piece of information, you're cheating. And if you read the Avon forum and look for stories of frustrated S writers living with an A, most of them come from people who suddenly discovered their partners are A's, who refrained from saying so beforehand, and who all of a sudden claim loud and clear as yourselves that everyone has the right to say no to sex in a relationship, and that the other partner has no right whatsoever to claim otherwise just because the A member overlooked that detail in the beginning. And this was my last response. No. What you're saying here is that only the asexual person must disclose that they expect a certain level of sex in a relationship, in this case, none or not very much, while everyone else has no obligation to disclose that they expect a certain level of sex in a relationship, in this case, twice or 3 times a week for 20 minutes to an hour. The bottom line is that you're claiming we have to disclose while you have a right to expect. And that the situation automatically defaults to your standard unless we say otherwise. I understand that you are saying that, and that you believe it's common sense just because many people have or want that amount of sex. I am disagreeing that it's right to expect it. And the fundamental difference in our opinion here is that you think the commonality of your opinion makes it automatically in effect unless someone explicitly takes exception. That is not how things should work in any relationship. Any person participating in a relationship should disclose what they want. And frequently, if those tricksy asexual trap monsters are not saying how they feel ahead of time, it is because they have been shamed by sexual normativity attitudes like this into thinking they will not deserve love, will not have positive attention from their partners, and may not be considered appropriate partners. I'm not defending dishonesty when I say this, but I do think the very expectation you have is what contributes to many asexual people's fear of disclosure. And again, many don't know how they will feel and think they will come to accept or tolerate it for the sake of the relationship. Stop spinning asexual people withholding information as if they're out to cheat non-asexual people out of something they had a right to expect. And stop contributing to problematic attitudes that make non-asexual people feel justified in expecting that satisfaction of their sexual desires on their terms is inherently part of the relationship package deal. And I'd also like to add this. Being in a relationship is not consent to sex. It is not understood consent to sex. It is not understood consent to any amount of sex, and it is not a blanket level of consent to sex that applies unless it's explicitly declined. Furthermore, it's a generalization that if you're not asexual, you won't suddenly dislike sex. People's sexual appetites change all the time. Just because you're not asexual does not mean you will forever want the same amount of sex, or that negotiations over how much sex will make your relationship satisfactory become non-negotiable once a marriage or long-term relationship is cemented. Non-asexual people have every right to change the contract too. And sometimes unforeseen circumstances like disability, illness, or just plain old fluidity of sex drive changes how you handle a relationship. You are not ever guaranteed to a certain amount of sex by virtue of securing a relationship. And this expectation at the root of all of this is what needs to be questioned. I know you have stated multiple times that you expect sex on your own terms as surely as cab drivers expect to be paid for their work. And I understand this is how you see the world. I think you should question it. And I think you should stop presenting one set of norms as any kind of default in a sexual relationship. They are statistics that exist to examine what is, not statistics that justify holding all relationships to that standard unless they explicitly opt out. Based on how this person talks, I imagine they will probably come back and reiterate how normal their expectations are and how lots of people who are not asexual are pissed off about this in the AVEN forums because people didn't disclose. But, I don't imagine that this can have really any more information added to it if the conversation continues, so I'm just going to put it in a video now. I'll also say that there was one other person in the conversation. One of my friends came in and gave the perspective as a married woman who likes sex, talking about how she agreed with me and how it's kind of ridiculous that anybody sits around expecting that their personal preferences in a sexual relationship should apply to everybody. So I really appreciated that a non-asexual person came in to be like, look, I don't support this either, and you're not representing what I consider to be the non-asexual person's perspective on this. It's not like every non-asexual person is going to agree with this person. So anyway, I just want to say to people like that, people who are allies, I really appreciate that you guys do stuff like this, that you are willing to speak up in these conversations where as an asexual person, I'm probably having my opinion and my perspective discounted all the time because of my orientation. And that, me saying, like, I've heard non-asexual people saying these things is not actually like believed or taken with the weight that it should be until somebody from your side actually says it. So that's my little message, my little thank you to the non-asexual people who have defended us in these conversations. I would love to see more of you guys. Don't feel like you're wading into a conversation that isn't yours. If you're just giving your perspective that disagrees with a mainstream one, we can always use your help. And, when in doubt, you can always ask us, would you like me to say something? That would be fine. I, for the most part, support it. But, if you want to make sure that you're not, talking over people, you can always check with us. Yeah, most of us really appreciate that kind of perspective coming in and maybe making people feel like, their perspective isn't automatically, the perspective of other people that are like them. Anyway, this is already quite long, I'm sure, from how this took up 9 pages in a Word document. So I will end this here, and I will see you for the next one.